When you hear ecofeminism, what comes to mind? Perhaps you think ecofeminism is based in some spiritual connection between Mother Earth and her daughters, set on preserving the magic that lays within her forests. Or perhaps you think an ecofeminist is a goddess warrior who sings to the birds and is fierce in her superiority over her male counterparts. Or perhaps you think of nothing, having never considered the connection between feminism and ecology. I ask you now to join me in considering these connections. This talk is aimed at dispelling the slightly alarming visions and providing an understanding of ecofeminism, one that is not spiritual, but rather practical. We will examine the basis of ecofeminism, the modernization of the theory, and the ability of ecofeminism to create a grassroots movement. Hello, I am Grace Frideger, and welcome to my senior TED Talk. During my senior project, I set out to answer the question, how can ecofeminism create a more inclusive and community-driven environmental movement? Looking at this question, one might respond with a different question first. Is the mainstream environmental movement not already inclusionary? The answer is no. Our mainstream environmental movement, with players such as Earth First, the Sierra Club, and the Nature Conservancy, have alarmingly little diversity. In a study conducted by Green 2.0, over 300 mainstream environmental organizations were surveyed. In the collection of all 300 organizations, only 16% of their staffers were people of color. 16%. On top of this, the mainstream movement is concerned largely with the conservation and preservation of classically beautiful places. This excludes environmental problems that are outside of that conservationist scope. This makes it clear that our mainstream movement, as it is currently, does not represent nor understand the environmental issues that face our country. So, if the mainstream environmental movement is insufficient in addressing the environmental problems outside of the conservationist scope, what is ecofeminism and how can it do what the mainstream movement cannot? First, what is ecofeminism? It is clearly not spiritual connection to earth or goddess warriors. It is a theory based on the idea that feminist issues and ecological issues are combined and that they are a result of male domination of society. Let's unpack this. How can people and nature be dominated by similar means? The claim that the domination of women is tied to the domination of nature is rooted in the logic of domination. A more dominant force will take power over a less dominant force, leading to a power structure. Males are classically seen as more powerful and more capable, thus assuming power over the less capable woman. Humans historically have always considered themselves to be more capable and powerful than the natural world, thus assuming power over it. Historically, males have taken power over females much in the same way humans have taken power over the environment. The logic of domination is a central player in systems such as the patriarchy, capitalism, and imperialism, all things that have led to the domination of women and our environment. So, now that we have a basic understanding of the theory, we are now presented with the next question. What is the ecofeminist theory? This is where the theory is translated into the practice. While the theory of ecofeminism was important during its early years, the practicality of the theory is now of greater importance. If the theory is not able to translate well into practical application, it is irrelevant. Therefore, making sure that the theory is current and up to date is hugely important. The ecofeminist movement was a movement that was created in the 1970s, alongside the mainstream environmental movement. It was created to fight issues not commonly addressed by the mainstream movement, issues such as nuclear production, landfill management, and unregulated chemical dumping. Historically, issues considered and addressed by ecofeminism are issues that affect and exist within the community. Because of this connection to the community and effect it has on it, grassroots organization and activism through the community is of central importance to the movement. Grassroots activism is community-organized groups with political agendas. Grassroots endeavors build from the ground up, using the people from the community to strengthen the movement and ultimately affect the change they are asking for. There are two phases of ecofeminism, the first beginning in the 1980s. Each phase uses grassroots activism, but in different ways. During the early phase of ecofeminism, the central focus of the movement was women-based organizing. After the creation of the Eco-Feminist Movement in the 1970s, organizations that were true embodiments of women-driven grassroots action were founded. These organizations created a movement that was specific to women, using gender as a central part of their endeavors. Great Old Broads is an organization that is based here in the Southwest and was created in the 80s. As the name infers, it is a group of women fighting for the preservation of our lands. And their primary focus is laid on providing elderly women with the platform to address the issues that they find important. Feminists for Animal Rights, no longer in existence, fought for the protection of animals, women, and the earth, stating in their mission statement that they were concerned with the treatment of women, animals, under patriarchy. The Women's Environmental Movement, or the Women's Environmental Network, has similar goals of targeting women-based action through empowering women in their communities. An important milestone in the early days of the women-based movement was the Women's Pentagon Action of 1980. During this protest, over 2,000 women gathered outside of the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., protesting against imperialism, nuclear development, and environmental destruction. While these efforts were successful, they all have a catch. In all of these examples, the movement is limited to women, and predominantly white women. This inevitably created a movement that was blind to many environmental problems outside of this limited scope. This led to a movement that was equally as exclusive as the mainstream environmental movement. That is exactly what ecofeminism was created to ensure would not happen. It was created to provide a movement to give voice to oppressed peoples, but in turn it ended up excluding almost as many people as the mainstream environmental movement. The limitations of the gender-based movement became apparent in the mid-90s, and thus the second phase of ecofeminism was created. Similar to the progression of classical feminism, ecofeminism has shifted into an intersectional framework. Because ecofeminism is geared towards both environmental and social justice issues, it is continually adapting along with the shifts of our society and our environment. A purely gender-based approach was unsustainable in the way that it excluded as many people as the mainstream movement did. For that reason, the movement was changed to an intersectionalist movement. An intersectionalist approach removes the focus on gender alone to encompass all factors that lead to underrepresentation, factors such as race and class. Intersectional ecofeminism changes the movement in two key ways. It first modernizes the movement. It allows the movement to become receptive to the varied experiences of women and of all oppressed peoples. It in turn allows for greater understanding of the many environmental problems that affect different races, classes, and ethnicities. Secondly, it turns the movement into a movement that includes oppressed groups, oppressed through any category, thus opening the movement to males and females alike, females that might not be oppressed purely based on gender, more focusing on their race or their class, bringing in males who are underrepresented in the mainstream movement. Intersectional ecofeminism has shifted in demographics, but it has not shifted in its drive to address the environmental problems that exist in communities. The actions that have emerged under this intersectional approach are all focused on overcoming domination and injustice through community-driven, grassroots environmental action. Groups determined to address these issues of social and environmental strife existing in their communities are taking shape all over the country. In Flint, Michigan, a city classically of lower socioeconomic class and predominantly minority-based, use the power of their community to rise up and take control of their environmental justice. After citywide water contamination scandal, the community was in need of a rallying cause to stand behind and address the environmental and communal issues that threatened to dismantle their city. A woman named Jocelyn Hagerman saw the need and created Flint Forward, a grassroots environmental group to address the environmental violations and the anger and fear that existed within the community. It was created to provide the space and power to confront politicians, hold public hearings, and allow for these people to be heard. It provided a platform that does not exist otherwise and in any other framework. The group is led by women, men, whites, blacks, people of lower classes, all working for the goal of social and environmental improvement within Flint. Got Green, a collection of mothers, workers, tenants of low-income families, and communities of color, is a group that has also stepped up in taking on the environmental issues that the mainstream movement avoids. By working with working-class women of color in South Seattle, the food access team has been creating the Fresh Bucks, a farmer's market which has gone national. Got Green works in creating sustainable systems for the city of Seattle and ensuring environmental justice for its people of color and its minorities. This organization is empowering the members of the community to organize and affect real change in ways that matter. They are stepping into a movement that combats exclusion, sexism, racism, and other factors. All of these factors that contribute to the environmental problems and the social problems that exist in these communities and communities like it. The Southwest Organizing Project, an organization based close by in Albuquerque, New Mexico, is yet another grassroots environmental effort. The Southwest Organizing Project has programs devoted to the empowerment of Native American women and people of color, groups that are typically underrepresented. They believe that a community cannot be successful unless all members feel empowered and invested. The Southwest Organizing Project has been central in addressing urban landfill cleanup, water accessibility, and sustainable food resources and processes for communities within and outside of Albuquerque. The Southwest Organizing Project has an incentive called Swap con Mujeres, which is an initiative directly focusing on empowering women of the community. They are taught the ways of early feminism while ensuring all underrepresented groups are still heard. They are essentially creating a more inclusive movement through the basis of ecofeminism. They become leaders through seminars, lectures, and coalition building. The mantra they say after each meeting is, "It takes root to resist, defend, articulate, heal, and transform." In our communities of women, communities of African Americans, Latinos, indigenous peoples, rich people, and poor people, we are the change makers. In these communities, they are taking grassroots activism into their own hands to effect the environmental change that they want to see. In its origin, ecofeminism was a movement based on gender, but for the sake of practicality, it has become a movement based on people, filling a gap left by the mainstream environmental movement. In this gap, a movement created is a collection of smaller efforts to combat sexism, racism, classism, and environmental degradation. It is a movement that has switched from a gender-based movement to a movement that addresses all social and environmental injustices. It is because of this that I suggest intersectional ecofeminism should be the rallying and connecting point to which all of these smaller grassroots environmental organizations can rally behind. The time to address environmental problems is now. As these examples demonstrated, environmental issues exist locally, and only we have the power to generate the response that is needed. One must look no further than one state over in the fight against the reduction of bears' ears, that our environment will disappear if we do not actively work to ensure its protection. We need to use the tools of grassroots activism, protest, education, and involvement to reclaim bears' ears. A movement based on change to address the environmental and social implications of environmental degradation is essential to our communities and the success of the communities to follow. Our environment is our home, and it falls upon us to protect it in ethical and inclusive ways. Ecofeminism, paired with grassroots activism, is the movement that will continue to empower disempowered communities in order to tackle the environmental issues of our time. It is through this movement that we can create a more comprehensive fight against environmental and social issues, locally, nationally, and internationally. As the notable ecofeminist Ysantra King says, "In the practice of ecofeminism, we stand with hope. We stand with the belief that the future can be created by intentional human beings who take responsibility for our environment." Thank you.